Imagine sitting in a quiet room, your pulse loud in your ears, as a man you've known your entire life stands up and reads words your father wrote knowing you would hear them one day. And then the sentence lands. Clean. Cold. Surgical. My son Nicholas shall receive nothing from my estate, for reasons he knows well. Nothing else. No explanation. No forgiveness. No room to argue. Just nothing. Now ask yourself this. What would someone have to do for their own father to leave behind words like that? And what happens when those words are read after both parents are already dead? That's where this story begins. Not with the crime, not with the arrest, but with a will, a final message, a line that feels less like legal language and more like a verdict. Because long before police tape wrapped around a $13.5 million Brentwood estate, long before flashing lights and whispered rumors, something inside this family had already shattered. And no one noticed. Or maybe they did, and chose not to look too closely. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Rob Reiner was not just a father. He was a legend, a Hollywood fixture, a man whose voice shaped generations, whose work made people laugh, think, argue, and feel. His life, at least on the surface, looked complete, successful, admired, secure. But families don't break under spotlights. They break in private. Behind the gates of that Brentwood property, behind carefully managed public appearances, behind decades of status and wealth, something darker was unfolding, something unresolved, something that would end not just in death, but in erasure. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Wills don't come out of nowhere. They are written slowly, revised quietly, shaped by years of resentment, disappointment, fear, or certainty. And this one didn't just divide assets. It divided truth from silence. Let's rewind for a moment. On the surface, the Reiner family appeared like so many powerful Hollywood dynasties. Wealth, influence, access, protection. The kind of family where problems are handled internally, quietly, efficiently. But beneath that image were fractures. Old ones, deep ones. Nick lived on the property. Not inside the main house, but close enough to feel included. Or excluded, depending on how you look at it. A guest house can be a gift, or a message. You're here, but not quite in. He was 32, an adult, still tethered to his parents' world, still orbiting their gravity. And if you've ever lived in the shadow of someone powerful, you know how heavy that gravity can feel. Then there's Romy, the daughter, the one reports say discovered the bodies. The one who allegedly told police something chilling almost immediately. That there was a dangerous family member. That someone close should be a suspect. Think about that for a second. How fast would you name your own blood? How certain would you have to be? And then there's Jake. Quiet, observing, present, but silent. In families like this, silence is rarely neutral. It's strategic. It's learned. So when the news broke, people focused on the obvious. The crime, the brutality, the arrest. But the real story? It wasn't in the police report. It was in the paperwork. Because after Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were found dead, stabbed inside their own home, another moment followed that felt almost unreal. The reading of the will. This wasn't just a legal formality. This was a reckoning. And the man chosen to read it wasn't a lawyer. It was Billy Crystal, a close friend, a trusted voice, someone Rob believed could carry his words without distortion. That choice alone raises questions. Why not keep it clinical? Why not let attorneys handle it? Because maybe Rob didn't want this to feel clinical. Maybe he wanted it to feel personal. And when Billy Crystal stood there, holding that document, reading words written by a man who knew he was nearing the end of his life, something irreversible happened. Nick didn't just lose his parents. He lost his place in the story. Disinheritance isn't just about money. It's about identity. About being told, officially, that you are no longer part of the future someone imagined. And the wording matters. For reasons he knows well. That line is doing a lot of work. It suggests confrontation, or betrayal, or something never spoken publicly. It suggests that Rob believed Nick understood exactly why this was happening, that there had been conversations, warnings, lines drawn. But here's the twist. What if Nick didn't see it that way? What if what Rob saw as accountability, Nick experienced as abandonment? Because perspective is everything, especially in families where power is uneven. Parents remember discipline. Children remember rejection. And when resentment festers long enough, it doesn't always explode outward. Sometimes it implodes. Now let's talk about timing. Reports indicate the will had been updated not long before Rob's death. That detail matters, because revisions mean reconsideration. They mean something changed. You don't rewrite your will casually at 78 years old. You do it because something forces your hand. Fear, certainty, or knowledge. So ask yourself this. What did Rob know? What did he suspect? What did he fear enough to put it into writing? And here's another uncomfortable question. Was the will meant to punish or to protect? Because if Rob believed his son posed a danger, if he believed there was volatility simmering beneath the surface, disinheritance could have been his last attempt at control, his final boundary, or his final mistake. Because when people feel erased, humiliated, stripped of future security, they don't always respond rationally, especially if they already feel wronged. This is where the story stops being about inheritance and starts being about psychology. About how families fracture when communication dies. About how silence becomes weaponized. About how wealth doesn't insulate against emotional collapse. It amplifies it. The Reiner home wasn't just a residence. It was a pressure chamber. Old grievances, unspoken expectations, disappointment recycled year after year. And then one night, everything gave way. Police say Nick was arrested that same night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. That's not suspicion. That's accusation at the highest level. But this isn't a courtroom. And this story isn't about verdicts. It's about how things got here. Because long before handcuffs clicked, long before investigators walked through that house, long before Romy made that call, something else had already happened. A father decided his son would receive nothing. Not a dollar. Not an apology. Not even an explanation. Just a sentence. Waiting. Waiting to be read aloud after everyone involved was gone. And that's the most haunting part of all. Rob Reiner never had to face Nick after those words were heard. No confrontation. No response. No chance for reconciliation. Only aftermath. Only interpretation. Only fallout. So now you're left with impossible questions. Was the will a warning sign no one took seriously enough? Was it the final straw in a relationship already beyond repair? Or was it something else entirely, a message meant for someone other than the son who heard it? Because when Billy Crystal finished reading, the room reportedly fell silent. And in that silence, 3 siblings heard the same words and understood them very differently. No thunder. No screaming neighbors. No frantic 911 call echoing through the dark. It happened quietly. Too quietly. By the time police cars rolled through the gates of the $13.5 million Brentwood estate, the house was already still. Lights on. Doors closed. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel peaceful, only wrong. And here's the first unsettling question you should ask yourself. How long can something terrible exist inside a house before anyone notices? Because according to early reports, Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle didn't die in chaos. They died in their own home, in a space designed to protect them, surrounded by wealth, security systems, privacy, and time. And yet, no one came in time. Let's rewind to that Sunday. Brentwood is not just a neighborhood. It's a statement. Tree-lined streets, high walls, controlled access, homes designed to keep the world out. It's where people go when they want distance. From fans, from critics, from consequences. That morning looked ordinary from the outside. No flashing lights. No helicopters. No reporters lining the street. Neighbors went about their routines, unaware that something irreversible had already happened just beyond those gates. Inside the house, Rob Reiner and Michelle were dead. Stabbed. Not a single wound, but multiple. Which immediately raised a question investigators ask every time. What kind of emotion does it take to do that? This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. Nothing was missing. No signs of forced entry. No shattered windows or kicked-in doors. Whoever did this didn't need to break in. They already belonged. Police would later say the bodies were discovered by the Reiner's daughter, Romy, 27 years old, young enough to still see her parents as anchors. Old enough to recognize when something is deeply, horribly wrong. Imagine walking into your childhood home and realizing time has stopped. Imagine recognizing death not through noise or panic, but through silence. Romy's reaction matters. Because according to reports, she didn't just call police. She allegedly told them something else. Something that would shape everything that followed. She said there was a dangerous family member. Not a stranger. Not an intruder. Family. Think about the weight of that accusation. How many families would refuse to say that out loud, even when the evidence is staring them in the face? How many would protect the idea of family over the truth? Romy didn't. Which leads to another uncomfortable question. What had she seen before this night? Because accusations like that don't come from nowhere. They come from patterns, from moments that don't make headlines, from tension that builds slowly, then all at once. As police secured the scene, they began the methodical work. Photos, measurements, timelines. Who was where? Who had access? Who was supposed to be there and who wasn't? And almost immediately, attention turned to the guest house. Because on the same property, just steps away from the main residence, lived Nick, the son who had been erased from the will. The proximity is chilling when you think about it. Not miles away, not across town, not unreachable, close enough to hear movement, close enough to know routines, close enough to feel included or constantly reminded that he wasn't inside the main house anymore. That detail alone changes how you see the night. Because this wasn't a stranger crossing a threshold. This was someone who knew the layout, the habits, the rhythms of the home. Police arrested Nick that same night. Not days later. Not after weeks of investigation. That speed tells you something. It tells you the focus narrowed fast. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Premeditation. Intent. Not accident. Not heat of the moment. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because nothing about this night feels impulsive. No signs of a loud argument reported by neighbors. No calls placed in the middle of a fight. No visible struggle spilling into public view. This looks planned. Or at the very least, emotionally prepared. And that forces us to look backward. Because moments like this don't appear fully formed. They grow. They grow in ghost houses and dinner tables and uncomfortable silences. In withheld approval. In conversations that never happen. What was the relationship like in the days leading up to that Sunday? Reports remain careful, guarded. But pieces begin to emerge when you look at behavior instead of statements. Rob Reiner was 78. Michelle was 70. This was not a couple living in fear of the outside world. They had resources, security, experience. Yet something had changed. Friends would later say Rob had been reflective in recent months. More deliberate, more cautious. That lines up with the will revision. You don't revise your will because you're bored. You do it because something feels unresolved. Something feels risky. And now place that knowledge next to the scene itself. A home with no forced entry. A suspect who lived on the property. A daughter who immediately warned police about a family member. The picture sharpens. But here's the contradiction. If this was expected, even feared, why was nothing done sooner? Why didn't anyone intervene? Move out? Create distance? Call for help? That's where family dynamics come into play. Because when danger is familiar, it doesn't always feel urgent. It feels normal, manageable, something you've survived before. Until you don't. As investigators worked through the night, Hollywood stayed asleep. The world that knew Rob Reiner as a voice, a creator, a personality had no idea he was already gone. And when news finally broke, it landed like a shockwave. Not just because of who died, but because of who was accused. The phrase, son arrested in parent's murder, hits differently. It disrupts something fundamental. It forces people to confront a truth they'd rather ignore. Families can be the most dangerous place of all. As police escorted Nick away, the narrative was already forming. Headlines, speculation, judgment. But the real story was still incomplete. Because this wasn't just about what happened that night. It was about everything that led up to it. The guest house, the will, the silence, the sentence waiting to be read, and most importantly, the relationships that had been deteriorating long before anyone dialed 911. As the sun rose over Brentwood, the Reiner estate became a crime scene. Tape fluttered in the breeze. Officers stood watch. And inside, the weight of decades pressed down on a single question. Was this inevitable? Or did everyone miss the moment when it still could have been stopped? Because if you believe the will was written as a warning, then this night wasn't a surprise. It was a conclusion. But if you believe the will was an act of cruelty, then this night becomes something else entirely. A reaction, a rupture. And that's where the story truly begins to turn. Because once you understand who Nick was inside that family, the night stops being random. It starts to feel personal. He wasn't inside the house that night. But in many ways, Nick had always been living on the outskirts of his family's world. A guest house can feel like a luxury, or a sentence, close enough to participate, yet always reminded that you are not fully included. For Nick, it was both. By the time the investigation began, details about his life in that small, separate dwelling started to emerge. Neighbors had seen him casually walking the grounds, sometimes carrying groceries for his parents, sometimes retreating quickly after a phone call. His presence was constant but quiet, a shadow moving along the edges of the main estate. Think about that for a second. How often do you live in a space that is physically part of a home but emotionally segregated? It's a strange psychological tension. You can hear laughter, smell meals, witness daily routines, yet never feel like you belong. It creates a constant sense of observation without participation. Friends described Nick as intelligent but temperamental, a man who could charm effortlessly in public, yet privately carried grudges that ran deep. The combination of wealth, proximity, and resentment can be explosive. Being so close, yet excluded, is a pressure cooker that intensifies emotions. Every interaction becomes a microcosm of power dynamics, expectations, and perceived slights. What made Nick's situation even more complex was his father's exacting standards. Rob Reiner, the successful director, the Hollywood icon, had a public persona of wit and warmth, but privately, reports suggest, he was demanding. He wanted discipline, respect, and compliance from his children, particularly Nick. And Nick, for reasons only his father seemed to understand, did not consistently meet these expectations. Here's the striking detail: the will. The sentence that disinherited him was not an impulsive decision. It was deliberate, written with intention, and the phrasing, "for reasons he knows well," implies a shared history of grievances, conversations, and disappointments. This wasn't legal jargon. It was a message, one designed to sting, one designed to be remembered. But what exactly could Nick have done to warrant this? That question lingers, because no public record fully explains the depth of conflict within the Reiner family. Some speculate disagreements over personal choices. Others suggest long-simmering resentments dating back to childhood. Whatever the truth, it was enough for Rob Reiner to formally remove his son from the family's financial narrative. Now, consider the psychology here. Being disinherited is more than losing money. It is symbolic exclusion, a formal acknowledgement that you are not worthy of legacy, approval, or recognition. And when someone in Nick's position hears this, especially in the presence of a trusted family friend like Billy Crystal reading it aloud, it's not just shocking, it's a declaration of judgment. Nick's reaction to the reading remains mostly private, but the tension in the room must have been palpable. Imagine processing the erasure of your entire inheritance while standing in the same house where your parents lived, where you were allowed proximity but denied full inclusion. The emotional complexity is staggering. Humiliation, anger, and confusion all collide in moments like this. And yet, despite this, Nick did not live a completely isolated life. Reports describe him as socially connected, attending industry events, maintaining friendships, and engaging with extended family. But those external successes likely offered little solace against the immediate, visceral rejection represented by the will. What makes this even more chilling is the timing. Nick had been living on the property, in close proximity, at the same time the will was being finalized. He knew something was changing. Perhaps he suspected disfavor. Perhaps he anticipated conflict. But the exact moment of revelation, hearing the words read aloud, was uncontrollable. There was no escape, no early warning. Just the realization that he had been formally erased. Now, layer this personal conflict with the tragic events of that fateful night. When investigators arrived, Nick was in the guest house. That physical distance is ironic. He was close enough to the crime scene to be implicated, yet far enough away to create confusion over intent and access. It is precisely this proximity that made him the focus of early investigations. Think about the psychological pressure in that environment. On one side, a parent you admire and fear. On the other, the knowledge that you are officially excluded from family legacy. Combine that with isolation, potential resentment, and the dynamics of an emotionally tense household, and the scene is set for catastrophe, or at the very least, intense confrontation. This is where Romy's role becomes crucial. She reportedly discovered the bodies and immediately identified a dangerous family member. That warning signals more than instinct. It signals awareness. Awareness that someone inside the household, someone close, could act violently. In other words, Nick's psychological profile, when viewed alongside family dynamics, was already under scrutiny even before authorities arrived. And then there is Jake. Observers describe him as quiet, reserved, watching events unfold with a measured detachment. His presence, in contrast to Nick's proximity and Romy's assertiveness, illustrates another layer of family complexity. Different siblings process conflict and tension differently. One internalizes, one acts, and one observes. So when you ask yourself why the night ended the way it did, you cannot ignore the pressures that had been building for years. You cannot ignore the guest house's symbolic separation. You cannot ignore the reading of a will that stripped a son of his place in the family legacy. Everything converged: proximity, isolation, resentment, and revelation. A perfect storm hidden beneath the veneer of wealth and success. And that is why understanding Nick's position in the family is crucial. Because without seeing him as someone constantly on the edge of inclusion and exclusion, the events of that night appear random. With that perspective, they become tragically inevitable. But here is the cliffhanger for this chapter. The will had been read, the bodies discovered, and the arrest made, but the story wasn't over. Because behind the public persona of Rob Reiner, behind the Hollywood legacy, there existed private fractures and long-standing conflicts that no one outside the family fully understood. Rob Reiner was many things to many people. To the world, he was a Hollywood legend. A director who could elicit laughter, tears, and reflection in equal measure. But behind the cameras, behind the accolades, behind the iconic films and charismatic interviews, he was first and foremost a father. And as we now know, being a father can be far more complicated than being a filmmaker. Publicly, Rob had the persona of a warm, approachable figure, a man who could make anyone feel like an old friend. He told stories that entertained, that inspired, that touched hearts. But privately, he was exacting, demanding, a man who valued responsibility, discipline, and accountability, especially from his children. It is often the case that those who charm millions can be most unforgiving to those closest to them. Michelle, his wife, shared in that household dynamic. Together, they managed a family, a legacy, and a home that was both sanctuary and crucible. But even the strongest partnerships have tensions, and the Reiners were no exception. Reports suggest that Rob and Michelle's relationship was a mix of deep love, mutual respect, and occasionally clashing personalities. They had standards, and they expected their children to uphold them. Nick, the son who lived in the guest house, often found himself at odds with those standards. Whether it was personal choices, lifestyle decisions, or simple misunderstandings, the friction was clear. To Rob, these conflicts may have seemed like teachable moments. To Nick, they may have felt like constant judgment, even rejection. Over the years, small tensions accumulate into larger fractures. By the time the will was written, these fractures were deep and consequential. Now, let's talk about the will itself. The sentence that left Nick completely disinherited is not just a legal formality. It is a narrative. It tells a story in the fewest words possible. My son Nicholas shall receive nothing from my estate, for reasons he knows well. Notice the phrasing. It doesn't merely exclude. It commands acknowledgement of past grievances. It assumes that Nick understands the context. There is no room for ignorance, no space for misinterpretation. It is final. It is precise. It is personal. And the timing of this will is critical. It was finalized shortly before Rob's death. That's not coincidental. Revising a will late in life is often a response to shifting perceptions, recent events, or lingering concerns. In Rob's case, it may have reflected a culmination of decades of family dynamics, disappointments, and perhaps warnings unheeded. The document becomes not just a distribution of assets, but a codified account of judgment, a record of unresolved conflict, and a form of control extending beyond life itself. Imagine, for a moment, being the person who hears these words read aloud by a close family friend like Billy Crystal. You can feel the weight of the words themselves, but you can also feel the room's tension. Every person present knows the significance. Every person understands the gravity. And you, as the recipient, are confronted with the stark reality that you have been formally erased from a narrative you once thought you were part of. Romy's role in all of this cannot be understated. She is the daughter who reportedly discovered her parents' bodies and immediately alerted authorities to a dangerous family member. That statement is striking for its clarity, its courage, and its implication. To call someone dangerous is to assert that previous patterns of behavior cannot be ignored. It is both an accusation and a warning, revealing an acute awareness of family dynamics that others may have downplayed. Then there is Jake. Quiet, observing, reserved. In high-stakes family dramas, there are always different roles: the observer, the instigator, the mediator, the one who takes action. Jake appears to have occupied the observer role, watching the unfolding events with measured detachment. And yet, even in silence, presence matters. Observers see patterns, notice inconsistencies, and absorb tensions that might otherwise go unrecognized. But back to Rob. What drove him to make such a final and uncompromising decision in his will? It is likely a combination of accumulated frustration, fear, and desire for control. Parents often fear losing influence over adult children, and in extreme cases, this fear can manifest in rigid, punitive measures. Disinheritance is one such measure, a way to assert authority even after death. And yet, there is irony here. Rob, a man celebrated for creating stories that explored human emotion and complexity, could not fully reconcile the emotional intricacies within his own family. He could direct actors, craft narratives, and evoke empathy for fictional characters, but when it came to his own children, the script was incomplete. This is where tragedy begins to take shape. The will's reading, the knowledge of the disinheritance, and the proximity of Nick's living situation all converge. The dynamics that may have been manageable or contained in the past suddenly become combustible. Living close to someone who has symbolically erased you can heighten emotional tension in ways outsiders rarely appreciate. Consider the psychological strain. Nick had to process his father's judgment, the public knowledge of the will, and the sense of exclusion, all within the confines of a space that physically tethered him to his parents. It's a paradox, being simultaneously near and apart, present yet invisible in the most crucial moments. That kind of psychological pressure can intensify emotions that already teeter on the edge. Romy's awareness adds another layer. Her perception of danger, her immediate recognition of a family member's potential involvement, and her willingness to act demonstrate an understanding of risk that others may have underestimated. She saw patterns and acted on them, highlighting the divergence in how different family members perceived reality. And then there is Jake's silence. Observing does not equate to disengagement. Often, observers accumulate insights, notice inconsistencies, and carry unspoken judgments that can influence future decisions or reactions. His quiet presence contrasts sharply with the visible emotional intensity of the others, emphasizing the complexity of family dynamics. All these factors, proximity, exclusion, judgment, perception, silence, combine into a tense environment where anything can happen. And in this case, something did. The events of that night were not random. They were the culmination of years of unspoken conflict, misaligned expectations, and escalating tension. But here's the cliffhanger for this chapter. Understanding the family dynamics and Nick's position in the household sets the stage, but it still doesn't explain why the night ended in tragedy. The next chapter will delve into Rob Reiner himself, public icon, private father, and explore how the pressures of legacy, expectation, and unspoken grievances shaped the environment that made such a night possible. The man who the world knew as a Hollywood legend was, first and foremost, a father, a fact that many overlook when they only see the accolades, the interviews, and the box office numbers. Rob Reiner's films brought laughter, contemplation, and even tears, but behind the scenes, the stakes were far higher, far more personal. He was tasked with shaping lives, not just stories. And sometimes, shaping lives is far more complicated than directing actors on a soundstage. Rob's public persona was disarming. Warm, witty, approachable. He had a charisma that made even strangers feel like old friends. But behind that charm lay a man with exacting standards. A man who expected accountability, discipline, and respect from his children, especially from Nick. Reports suggest that Rob did not shy away from expressing disappointment or enforcing rules, and while such discipline can be constructive, it can also build resentment if not balanced with empathy. Michelle, his wife, played an equally important role in the family dynamic. Together, they managed a household that combined comfort, privilege, and high expectations. But even the strongest partnerships have friction. The Reiners were no exception. Their parenting style blended love and rigor, support and expectation. They wanted their children to succeed, yes, but also to adhere to a moral and behavioral standard that they believed necessary. Nick, living in the guest house, was at the center of this complex dynamic. Close enough to feel part of the family, yet far enough to feel its exclusion. That proximity amplified every small conflict, every disagreement, every perceived slight. Imagine living day to day knowing that you are simultaneously observed and marginalized, guided and judged. The emotional strain is almost unimaginable. Every word, every gesture becomes charged with layers of expectation and history. The will itself became the crystallization of these tensions. That single sentence excluding Nick, "My son Nicholas shall receive nothing from my estate, for reasons he knows well," was both legal and deeply personal. It carried the weight of years of judgment, disappointment, and unspoken grievances. There is no ambiguity in that phrasing. The words assume understanding on the part of the son. They convey not only exclusion, but also a demand for recognition of past offenses. Timing is critical here. The will was revised shortly before Rob's death. Such revisions are rarely casual. They reflect changing perceptions, heightened concerns, and a desire to assert control. In Rob's case, the will was more than a document. It was a final expression of authority, a last attempt to shape his family's future from beyond the grave. Now imagine Nick hearing these words read aloud by Billy Crystal, a close family friend. The tension in the room would have been palpable. There's a psychological weight in having your erasure announced not by a stranger, but by someone who carries credibility, trust, and personal connection. The disinheritance isn't just financial. It's a profound statement about worth, place, and legacy. Romy's presence adds another critical dimension. As the daughter who reportedly discovered the bodies, she immediately named a dangerous family member. That assertion is telling. It reveals not only awareness, but recognition of long-standing patterns of behavior that may have been invisible or ignored by others. Romy's clarity contrasts sharply with Nick's proximity and Jake's observation, illustrating the different ways each sibling navigated family tension. Jake's silence, in turn, is telling in its own right. Observers in family crises often accumulate knowledge quietly, noting patterns and behaviors while resisting direct intervention. Jake's role as the silent witness underscores the complex spectrum of responses to familial conflict: engagement, avoidance, and observation. Each has consequences, some immediate, some delayed. And then there is the tragic night itself. The convergence of proximity, disinheritance, family tension, and unspoken grievances created a situation primed for catastrophe. Nick, the son living in the guest house, had been under psychological pressure for years. The reading of the will, the weight of exclusion, and the sudden awareness of his parents' mortality formed a combustible mix. Romy's vigilance, Jake's silence, and Nick's marginalization intersected in a single night that would shatter the family and capture public attention. The physical layout of the estate, guest house, main house, secured perimeters, was a microcosm of the emotional geography of the Reiner family. Near yet distant, observed yet excluded, loving yet tense. This is where the personal intersects with the tragic. The pressures of legacy, expectation, and exclusion are forces invisible to outsiders, but profoundly felt by those within the household. They shape decisions, magnify resentment, and, in extreme cases, can precipitate irreversible actions. And yet, despite the tension, despite the exclusion, Nick had maintained a life outside the immediate household: social circles, professional engagements, and friendships that provided external validation. But none of that could buffer him from the immediate, visceral impact of being formally disinherited in a room where the authority of his father and the presence of trusted friends left no room for deflection. The irony is stark. Rob, a man celebrated for his ability to tell human stories on screen, could not fully navigate the human story unfolding under his own roof. He could elicit emotion from audiences, but struggled to reconcile it within the walls of his family home. The layers of tension, the reading of the will, Nick's proximity, Romy's intervention, Jake's observation, culminate in a psychological landscape fraught with risk. Every element interacts with the others, creating an environment where the tragic outcome, while shocking, is rooted in a complex history of expectations, disappointments, and familial pressure. And so we arrive at the cliffhanger for this chapter. Understanding Rob Reiner's dual role as public icon and private father illuminates the pressures that shaped the Reiner household. But to comprehend the night that ended in tragedy, we must next examine the will itself, its revisions, its reading, and the profound impact of a single sentence that would alter lives forever. A few words on paper, inked deliberately, carrying decades of expectation, frustration, and judgment. My son Nicholas shall receive nothing from my estate, for reasons he knows well. Simple, final, unforgiving. The will itself was unassuming in appearance, a legal document among many, but its implications were monumental. It was the physical manifestation of a father's judgment, a record of grievance codified into law. And when Billy Crystal stood to read it aloud, those words were no longer abstract. They became living, breathing, inescapable reality. Why Billy Crystal? That question is worth unpacking. Rob didn't have a lawyer read the will, as is typical. He chose a friend, a confidant, someone who understood the nuances of personal relationships and could deliver not just the text, but the emotional weight behind it. That choice speaks volumes about Rob's intent. This was not merely administrative. This was personal. He wanted these words to land where they mattered most. Imagine being in that room. The anticipation, the quiet tension, the knowledge that the reading isn't just about dividing assets, but about acknowledging failures, omissions, and ruptures. Each sentence carries weight. Each pause is measured. And then the critical line comes. Silence falls. Eyes shift. Hearts pound. Nick's reaction, though largely private, can be imagined. A visceral recognition of erasure, humiliation, and rejection. Disinheritance is not just a financial blow. It is a declaration of worthlessness in the arena of legacy. A symbolic excision from a narrative he had once believed he belonged to. And it wasn't just Nick. Everyone in that room felt it. The sharpness, the finality, the unspoken history compressed into a single line. Romy, Jake, and others present were forced to reconcile decades of family tension in real time, through the words of someone who was no longer there to clarify, excuse, or soften. But the timing of the will adds another layer of complexity. Reports indicate that it was revised shortly before Rob's death. Revisions at that stage in life are rarely casual. They reflect new insights, heightened concerns, and, sometimes, fears. In this case, the will could have been Rob's attempt to assert control, establish boundaries, or record final judgments before it was too late. Consider the psychological impact on Nick. Proximity to the estate meant proximity to authority, observation, and history. He lived steps away from the home where he had grown up, where he had experienced both inclusion and exclusion, love and judgment. And now, with the will read, he is confronted with the most concrete form of exclusion possible. It's important to recognize that inheritance isn't only about money. It's about validation, acknowledgement, and belonging. By being disinherited, Nick was denied not only assets, but also a form of legitimacy within the family narrative. It's an emotional wound disguised as legal action. And wounds like that don't heal overnight, especially when they occur under such emotionally charged circumstances. Romy's presence amplifies this tension. As the daughter who discovered the bodies and immediately identified a dangerous family member, she acted with clarity and urgency. Her assertion demonstrates acute perception of familial risk, signaling that the dynamics in the household were known, at least in part, to those living closest to the situation. Jake's silence, by contrast, illustrates a different dynamic. Observers often hold knowledge that isn't acted upon immediately. He watched, absorbed patterns, and perhaps understood the undercurrents in ways the others did not. His role highlights how family crises are experienced differently by each member. Some confront, some retreat, and some observe. Now layer in the broader context. Rob Reiner, the public icon, the storyteller, had successfully conveyed human complexity on screen. Yet within his own household, he could not fully navigate the interpersonal complexities that would later culminate in tragedy. His professional mastery of narrative did not translate into familial resolution. The reading of the will, therefore, functions on multiple levels. It is legal, emotional, symbolic, and prophetic. It crystallizes decades of family dynamics into a single moment. It defines relationships, asserts authority, and establishes boundaries that extend beyond death. And in doing so, it sets the stage for the irreversible events that follow. Consider the emotional landscape of that moment. There is tension, disbelief, shock, and perhaps an undercurrent of anger. There is also reflection, as each person present must reconcile the past with the immediate reality of the will's pronouncement. The reading becomes a mirror, reflecting both the family's history and the fractures that have long been ignored. And here's the chilling aspect. The will wasn't just about inheritance. It was about the future. By disinheriting Nick, Rob effectively removed him from the ongoing story of the family's legacy. In the minds of those present, it was more than money lost. It was place, recognition, and authority denied. This sets the scene for what comes next. Because once the will was read, the family dynamic shifted irrevocably. Old grievances, long-standing resentments, and suppressed tensions suddenly had new clarity. And while the document itself could not cause violence, it became a catalyst in an environment already fraught with psychological and emotional pressure. And that's the cliffhanger. The will has been read, the sentence pronounced, and the room heavy with unspoken consequences. But outside this room, in the guest house, on the estate, and in the minds of those who lived there, the reverberations of a single sentence were just beginning. Romy's instincts kicked in the moment she realized something was wrong. Reports indicate that she discovered her parents' bodies first, a scene that would have paralyzed most people. But Romy acted. She called the police. She provided details. And perhaps most chillingly, she identified a dangerous family member. A warning that shifted the focus of the investigation and framed the narrative from the very beginning. Think about that for a moment. To point the finger at someone close, someone related by blood, is no small act. Families often protect their own, even in the face of undeniable evidence. But Romy didn't. She made a choice that would forever define her involvement, her perception, and her role in the unfolding tragedy. Romy's position in the household was unique. She was close enough to witness tensions firsthand, but may have been somewhat removed from the daily friction between Nick and their father. That distance allowed her clarity, a kind of observational advantage. She saw patterns, understood danger, and acted decisively. And that action would influence the direction of the investigation immediately. It's also critical to understand the psychological strain she must have experienced. Discovering the bodies of your parents, realizing a sibling could be implicated, and navigating the overwhelming mixture of fear, shock, and grief. These are pressures most people cannot even imagine. Yet Romy navigated them with a combination of clarity and urgency, prioritizing immediate action over hesitation. Her decision to alert authorities about a potentially dangerous family member raises questions about what she knew beforehand. Did she witness behavioral patterns that indicated risk? Were there warnings she had ignored or feared to confront? Or was her recognition purely instinctual, born from subtle cues and decades of living within a complex household? The answer remains partly speculative, but her proactive stance suggests a heightened awareness of the family's internal dynamics. Now consider Nick's proximity. He lived just steps away, in the guest house, a constant presence in the household ecosystem. Romy's identification of him as a potential suspect would have been informed by both his history within the family and his immediate location relative to the crime scene. That combination of psychological and physical proximity made him the primary focus, and Romy's actions accelerated that scrutiny. Meanwhile, Jake, the other sibling, observed. He is described as quiet, reserved, and thoughtful, someone who absorbs information rather than immediately reacting. In high-pressure family crises, observers often hold insights that are invisible to others. They notice patterns, pick up on subtle cues, and understand underlying tensions. Jake's silence does not imply disengagement. It represents a different mode of processing and coping within a volatile situation. The family dynamics leading up to this night cannot be overstated. The guest house, the will, the tension between Nick and Rob, Romy's awareness, and Jake's observation all converge to create a psychological landscape of extreme pressure. Each element interacts with the others, amplifying emotions and increasing the risk of catastrophic outcomes. And yet, despite all this, the tragic events unfolded in a way that was both shocking and, in retrospect, tragically predictable. Long-standing resentments, symbolic exclusions, and unresolved conflicts had been accumulating over years, quietly shaping behavior, decisions, and reactions. The reading of the will, while not a cause in itself, acted as a catalyst, crystallizing grievances and making the consequences painfully clear. Now, let's take a moment to examine Romy's courage. Naming a family member as dangerous is not just an act of perception. It is an assertion of moral responsibility. It requires assessing risk, overcoming fear, and prioritizing truth over loyalty. Her actions set in motion investigative steps that would shape public understanding and influence legal proceedings. Yet even Romy's decisiveness is shadowed by complexity. She must now navigate the dual reality of grieving her parents while confronting the possibility that her own sibling was involved in their deaths. This duality, grief and suspicion, is emotionally taxing in ways that defy easy description. The psychological toll of such circumstances is immense, affecting memory, judgment, and emotional regulation. Layered atop this is the broader context of the Reiner household. Rob's public persona as a storyteller contrasts sharply with the private pressures within his home. The family's internal narrative, dominated by expectations, disinheritance, and unresolved conflict, intersected tragically with the real-life events of that night. Romy's role, therefore, serves as a lens through which we can understand both the immediacy of the crisis and the decades-long buildup of tension. And now we reach the cliffhanger for this chapter. Romy acted, Nick's presence was undeniable, and Jake remained the silent observer. The pieces were in place, and the investigation had begun. But what had been set in motion that night would ripple far beyond the walls of the estate, challenging assumptions, uncovering hidden truths, and forcing everyone involved to confront the stark reality of a family fractured in the most irreversible way possible. By now, the weight of the Reiner estate had shifted. It was no longer just a family home. It had become a crime scene, a psychological pressure chamber, and the stage for a story that would grip the public imagination. And at the center of it all stood Nick, once a son, now a suspect, now a figure whose every movement would be scrutinized under the harshest lights. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being a member of a family with wealth, status, and legacy, and then, overnight, becoming the person everyone watches, not for who you are, but for what you might have done. That is the reality Nick faced. His existence in the guest house, once a symbol of inclusion at the margins, had become a focal point of suspicion. Every decision he had made, every interaction he had experienced, was now open to interpretation, replayed in the minds of law enforcement, family, and the media. The timeline is important. Early reports indicate the bodies were discovered Sunday evening. Nick was arrested that same night. The speed of the arrest suggests investigators quickly focused on him, based on location, history, and Romy's warning. When proximity, past family tension, and potential motive converge, law enforcement often identifies a primary suspect rapidly. That's exactly what happened here. But let's pause to consider the emotional context. Nick was 32, living in the guest house, aware of his father's expectations, and now confronted with formal disinheritance. That legal action was not just symbolic. It was a profound, psychological blow. Being disinherited doesn't only strip a person of wealth. It strips them of acknowledgement, validation, and perceived legitimacy within the family. The psychological strain of such a moment can be immense, particularly when it's combined with proximity to those whose approval has always been vital. Meanwhile, investigators began piecing together the evening, examining entrances, timelines, and physical evidence. Nothing was missing from the estate. No forced entry had been reported. That detail matters. It suggests the perpetrator had access, knowledge, or both, factors that inevitably directed focus inward, towards someone already part of the household. And then there's the role of the will. Earlier that day, or days before, depending on timing, the sentence that disinherited Nick had been read aloud. That alone adds an incredible layer of psychological tension. Imagine absorbing the knowledge that your father, moments from death or just before it, had chosen to formally erase you from his legacy. And now, within hours, tragedy strikes. The alignment of emotional stress, historical grievances, and physical proximity creates conditions ripe for catastrophic outcomes. Romy's involvement further complicated matters. Her immediate recognition of danger and decision to report a family member as potentially responsible reframed the investigation. She didn't speculate or hesitate. She named a threat, and that name guided law enforcement. Her decisiveness likely prevented further confusion, but it also cemented the narrative that would follow, that the perpetrator was someone close, someone with intimate knowledge of the estate and the family. Jake, the silent observer, is equally important. In family crises, observers often serve as repositories of unspoken knowledge. They notice patterns, detect inconsistencies, and track emotional undercurrents. Jake's presence contrasts with the overt tension in Romy and Nick. Observation can be powerful, sometimes more so than action, because it allows insight to accumulate, influencing responses when the time comes. And so, the night unfolds like this. The bodies are discovered, law enforcement is alerted, a suspect is identified, and a family's private fractures are cast into the public eye. The convergence of the will, the guest house, familial tension, and immediate action creates a scenario that feels both chaotic and inevitable. Consider the irony. Rob Reiner, a man celebrated for his ability to craft intricate narratives that explore human complexity, could not prevent a narrative of his own family from spiraling into tragedy. His professional mastery of story did not translate into a resolution of private conflict. And the will, which was meant to assert control, to codify judgment, had inadvertently become a catalyst, illuminating fissures that had long been simmering. From a psychological standpoint, the scenario is almost textbook. Proximity to perceived exclusion, compounded by explicit rejection, can amplify emotional volatility. The presence of observers, witnesses, and interveners adds further pressure. When long-standing family tensions are suddenly crystallized through legal action or abrupt events, outcomes can become unpredictable, sometimes catastrophic. And that's the cliffhanger. The Reiner estate, once a symbol of legacy and status, is now a nexus of suspicion, grief, and psychological strain. Nick is under arrest. Romy's warnings have shaped the investigation. Jake's observation continues silently. And yet, this is only the beginning. Behind every statement, every report, every headline, there remain layers of family history, unspoken conflict, and hidden motives that the public has not yet seen. The house on that Brentwood estate was more than walls and windows. It was a stage where decades of unresolved tension had quietly rehearsed themselves, waiting for the moment when everything would converge. And converge it did. The investigation into Rob and Michelle Reiner's deaths began meticulously. Law enforcement focused on timelines, access points, and physical evidence, trying to reconstruct a night that had already shattered a family. But even as they collected facts, the emotional landscape remained tangled, because this was not a case of strangers or opportunistic crime. This was family. And family dynamics are rarely linear, rarely simple, and rarely predictable. Nick, as the primary suspect, became the lens through which the public would try to make sense of the tragedy. Living in the guest house, he was close enough to have intimate knowledge of his parents' routines and habits. That proximity alone is critical. It created a connection to the scene that investigators could not ignore. Yet, it also underscores the psychological pressure he faced. Every interaction, every disagreement, every perceived slight was magnified within the context of the family estate. Let's unpack that pressure. Imagine being formally disinherited, stripped of legacy and approval, and then remaining within physical and emotional reach of the parents who issued that judgment. Every glance, every word, every movement becomes charged with significance. Isolation within proximity is one of the most psychologically stressful circumstances a person can experience. It heightens tension, intensifies emotions, and magnifies potential conflicts. Romy's role during the investigation adds another layer of complexity. She did not merely discover the bodies. She provided critical information that shaped the narrative. Her identification of a dangerous family member immediately shifted law enforcement focus inward, emphasizing familial dynamics over external threats. Her decisiveness and clarity contrast with the public perception of a grieving daughter and illustrate a keen awareness of long-standing household tensions. Jake, the silent observer, continued to watch. While less active, his presence remained significant. Observers in high-stakes family crises often process and retain information that others miss. Their insights, though unspoken, can influence interactions, decisions, and interpretations of behavior. In this context, Jake's quiet attention provides a crucial counterbalance to Romy's immediate action and Nick's visible turmoil. Now consider the will again. The disinheritance of Nick, read aloud by Billy Crystal, was more than a legal declaration. It was a psychological turning point. The words, "for reasons he knows well," implied a shared history of grievance and judgment. The timing, just before Rob's death, added immediacy and finality. In one moment, Nick's relationship with his father was formally codified as fractured, a status with emotional and social consequences that could not be undone. From a psychological perspective, the convergence of these factors is critical. Proximity to exclusion, compounded by formal rejection, can increase stress, intensify resentment, and elevate the risk of volatile reactions. Add the presence of observers and the immediate implications of Romy's warning, and the environment becomes an emotional pressure cooker. But the story does not end with legal documents and family dynamics. The actual events of the night reveal a complex interplay of intention, opportunity, and history. Investigators began reconstructing the crime scene, analyzing movement, timing, and sequence. While reports remain incomplete, the available information suggests that the tragedy was not impulsive but occurred within a context already shaped by decades of tension, unspoken conflict, and marginalization. It is also essential to consider the irony of legacy. Rob Reiner, a man celebrated for crafting compelling, emotionally resonant stories on screen, could not control the narrative within his own household. The will, intended as a mechanism of control and order, became a catalyst for chaos, highlighting unresolved issues and emotional fault lines that had long been ignored. The emotional weight of this scenario is almost unimaginable. Nick, formally excluded from his family's legacy, remains physically close to the source of his exclusion. Romy, aware of potential danger, has acted decisively. Jake observes silently, internalizing the dynamics and tension, and the tragedy that unfolded cannot be fully separated from these emotional and psychological undercurrents. And here's the cliffhanger for this chapter. The night is over, arrests are made, and the will has been read. But the public narrative is only beginning to form. Hidden histories, private resentments, and emotional complexities remain beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The next chapter will delve deeper into Nick's personal experiences, the pressures of his marginalization, and the factors that may have made this tragedy tragically inevitable. The focus now turns squarely to Nick, his life, his mindset, and the pressures that had been building long before that fateful night. Living in the guest house was not just a matter of convenience. It was a constant, living reminder of his position in the family hierarchy, close enough to witness daily life, but excluded from the main sphere of influence. Observers outside might see luxury and comfort. Inside, it was a psychological limbo. Nick's existence in that space was shaped by layers of expectation and disappointment. Rob Reiner's standards were exacting. Nick often found himself judged against a yardstick that felt unattainable. Every misstep, every disagreement, was magnified, not just as behavior, but as a reflection of worth. Over time, small perceived slights accumulate into a larger sense of frustration, resentment, or alienation. And when those emotions interact with proximity, the effect can be volatile. It's important to understand that disinheritance is more than financial. The will's language, "for reasons he knows well," served as a formal, symbolic erasure. It is a legal acknowledgement that Nick had failed in some fundamental way. That knowledge is psychologically impactful. It imposes a permanent judgment that colors self-perception, identity, and familial relationships. Even the most self-assured individual could find such exclusion deeply destabilizing, especially when enforced in the very space where they live and move every day. The timing of the will is equally crucial. Being revised shortly before Rob's death, it reflects heightened concern, deliberate planning, and a desire to assert control. But it also acts as an emotional trigger. For Nick, the reading of the will was not abstract. It was immediate, visceral, and unavoidable. It cemented a rupture that may have been simmering for years, creating an emotional state fraught with anger, hurt, and confusion. Romy's role continues to shape the narrative. Her discovery of the bodies and immediate warning about a dangerous family member shifted focus, framed law enforcement's understanding, and highlighted an awareness of behavioral patterns that others may have overlooked. Her actions demonstrate not just courage but psychological acuity. She perceived risk where others may have denied it and acted decisively to address it. Jake, the silent observer, represents another dimension. Observation is often underestimated in crisis scenarios. Observers can absorb subtle cues, recognize repeated patterns, and understand the interplay of personalities in ways that participants in direct conflict may not. Jake's quiet presence adds depth to the family dynamic and underscores the differing ways siblings internalize tension. The estate itself, with its guest house, main house, and secured grounds, functions as more than a residence. It becomes a physical representation of the emotional landscape. Proximity and exclusion, access and restriction, visibility and invisibility, all are coded into the very structure of the property. Nick's daily existence with